So the question then is science just kind of hanging out there? Is it just there? Or is it based on something? Okay? And when we think about the history of science, it's really instructive to understand where modern science as we think of it today came from. Because modern science actually grows out of the field of what is called natural philosophy. So the very early modern scientists, so we go back to the 16th and 17th century, and even before that, the early modern scientists were all philosophers, okay? So they operated in the field of philosophy, and what we think of as the study of the natural world was simply a category within the broader field of philosophy. So now we think of them as two very distinct fields. There's philosophy over here and there's science over here. But originally, science originated as a subcategory within philosophy. So what that means is that modern science grows out of philosophy. Okay? And that's an important thing for us to understand, because what many scientists want to do today is they want to draw a hard line between philosophy and science, and you can't do that. Okay? Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. Okay, so we finished our, last time we were together a couple weeks ago, we finished our section on various worldviews, talking about worldviews. So today we want to start our module on science. And so we'll be talking about science and scientific issues and that sort of thing for the next several weeks. And today, some of the things we want to talk about, just kind of introductory lesson on science, is we want to think about what is science, because actually that's not as easy to define as sometimes people would think it is. So we want to think a little bit about what science is, and then we want to talk about why would we talk about science in a class on Christian apologetics, okay? And related to that is the question about whether a non-scientist, and I'll be quite up front, I'm certainly not a scientist, so how is it that a layman like myself or maybe some of you can intelligently speak about questions of science, all right? Or even when you think about it, science is made up of a number of very specialized fields, and so you may have a person who's a scientist in one area who really knows nothing about the science in another area. So how is it that that someone who's a layman in a particular area can intelligently discuss what we might call the deliverances of science, or the things that science tells us? Some people might even debate the question of whether or not science is a good thing or a bad thing, right? So there's a lot of people who have just the idea that science is really destructive and it's really harmful in various ways, in things that it does, things that it develops, but also ideas that it promotes and that sort of thing. So is science a good thing or a bad thing? And then we want to talk about, is there some kind of a conflict between Christian faith and science? Because many people have this idea that there's this ongoing historical tension between Christianity and science, and so we want to think about that. So on the question of why do we talk about science in a class on apologetics? All right. And of course, there are just a number of misunderstandings that people have. There are misunderstandings that they have about science, about what science is, about the history of science. There are misunderstandings that people have about the Bible and what the Bible says in relationship to science. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the history of the relationship between Christianity and science. There are a lot of misunderstandings that people have, and these misunderstandings then become the basis of people's problems with Christianity, or their objections or their questions about Christianity. And so clearly we need to be, if we're going to be effective in sharing with people that have those kind of questions, we need to think about those. We need to be ready to address them. And then on this question of can a layman, can a non-scientist intelligently assess and critique the claims of science, the deliverances of. In addressing that question, I want to mention just a couple key things about science we need to keep in mind. Okay, so the first is, one of the aspects of science, of course, is the discovery of what we might call facts or data, or the compilation of facts and data. Okay, so science is in the business of looking at the natural world, looking at the material world, and accumulating facts and information about that world, and then presenting that to the rest of us. So that's one of the things that science does. But another thing that science does is then it takes those facts and tries to figure out, what do those facts mean? Okay, what's the implication of these facts that I have? So for example, you go up on top of a tall building and you drop a ball, and you think about the fact of what happens to the ball when you release it and how fast it falls and all that sort of thing. And you may accumulate a lot of data about that, and then you may go somewhere else and do it somewhere else. You may go to a higher altitude or a lower altitude. You may go to a different part of the world. And you do that, you accumulate all those facts, but then the question is, what do those facts mean? I mean, people throughout history have understood that if you were holding on to to some kind of an object, if you were holding on to of something and you released it, that it would fall. People have always known that. But Newton's the guy who kind of figured out, what does that mean, right? So there's the facts themselves, and then there's the interpretation of the facts. What do those facts mean, and what do they imply? So keep that in mind as we're addressing this question of how does a non-scientist deal with the issue of science. And the fact is that laymen are not just completely at the mercy of the scientists. Okay, we're not just completely dependent upon the scientists and just whatever they say, we're obligated to accept it. Okay, and one of the reasons is that the non-scientist, even though he may not be professionally trained, he may not have a master's or a doctorate degree in microbiology or physics or astronomy or whatever, he may not have a professional degree, but he can still be very well versed in science, in both the facts and the interpretations that science gives us. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that as laymen we have access to the knowledge of scientists and to the writings and the lectures and the talks and that sort of thing of well-regarded and very competent scientists. So, and today we have that even probably more so than ever before. We have access to computers and things like that. So as laymen then, we have access to a great deal of knowledge about science, even though we may not be professionally trained in the fields. So when it comes to this question of the data, then, you know, it's been said no person has the right to their own facts, right? So the facts are what they are, right? So we might think then that a scientist, he goes out and he collects the facts and he brings the facts to us and tells us these are the facts. As laymen, we are obligated to just accept that at face value. But that's not quite true, okay? Because we can ask ourselves, and we can ask the scientists, now wait a minute, you have the facts and you're making a claim about, or you're making a statement about what these facts mean. Do you have sufficient support? Are there enough facts there to say what you claim is true? So one place we oftentimes see this is in the discussion of the fossil record, okay? And so there are scientists out there that will claim, well, we can see certain things about evolution from the fossil record, okay? But a person who, even a layman who is somewhat informed about the fossil record, might wonder, do we have sufficient fossil record? Do we have sufficient data? Do we have sufficient facts in the fossil record to support the claim that's being made about evolution? The second question that we can ask about the data is it being accurately or honestly reported to us? Okay? And you know, typically, most of us tend to be fairly trusting and believing of people when they speak to us and they talk to us. And certainly, scientists carry with them just a very high kind of level of credibility. In our culture, we have a very high regard for scientists, and there's a good reason for that. Science has just done a lot of really remarkably great stuff. Okay, we're sitting here in a warm room with lights. You know, we have our iPhones and our computers and all this tech. All of this is, of course, the product of science, and so scientists are the ones who have given us these things, right? And so they carry a very high level of credibility within the society, and we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. And so we tend to believe what they tell us, but there is just enough in the history of science where we know that the so-called data that's been presented to us, this is the data, these are the facts, we know that it's not really been accurately reported. Now, I don't think this happens the majority of the time, but it has happened from time to time throughout the history of science, and sometimes in some very important areas, that it's incumbent upon the layman to say, wait a minute, how do I know that what you're telling me is true? So we have a number of examples down through history, particularly in the last couple hundred years or so. We have at the end of the 19th century, we have Haeckel's embryos, which turned out to be a fraudulent representation of how embryos develop. We had just here a few years ago, we had the scandal about the emails about climate change at East Anglia in England, at a university in England, where it was very clear that data was being manipulated, was being distorted, and intentionally so. So we need to ask, is it being accurately reported? And one of the problems we encounter is oftentimes science will say one thing, the scientist will maybe do some research or publish a paper, and he'll make certain statements or claims about what he saw or what he established, and then the media oftentimes will take that and run with it and say things that the scientists never said. Okay, so for example, in 1952, 53, you had what was called the Miller-Urey experiment, which was the experiment where Miller took certain chemicals he believed were in the early Earth, and he shot some electricity into them, and he got amino acids. Okay, of course, amino acids are an essential molecule for the development of life, for life to exist. So our bodies, all of our proteins are made up of amino acids. So if you're going to have proteins, you got to have amino acids. So he got amino acids. Well, he didn't claim to have created life, right? But many of the news reports said that the Miller-Urey experiment is proof that you can create life in a test tube, okay? That's just not reporting the facts, okay? He didn't create life, he simply created amino acids. And then the third question is, are there facts that are being overlooked? Is there information that perhaps a scientist or somebody reporting on what the scientist does is reporting, okay, science has told us this, and it's based on this data, but the question is is there some other data over here that's being overlooked, or maybe being ignored, or maybe even in some cases being hidden? So that I can justify this conclusion. We see this going on oftentimes in science. So one classic example is there have been several cases that happened. One case was down in Texas where the State Board of Education was trying to determine what kind of textbooks would be used in the teaching of biology, and the question that arose in the proceedings was, should high school students be made aware of problems with the Darwinian theory? Okay, so it's very clear. Any honest biologist, even many very advanced and sophisticated Darwinians recognize that there are significant challenges that Darwinian theory and neo-Darwinism doesn't have an answer to, and they're very open and they're very honest about that. The question is, should high school students be made aware of those problems, or should they only be taught the positive arguments for Darwinism? Okay? And it turns out that the Texas Board of Education determined, no, high school students aren't competent to judge those matters, so we should only teach the positive aspects of evolution and not require them to deal with the counter evidence until they get into college and oftentimes into postgraduate work, and then they'll be sophisticated enough they can deal with it. So what you have there is you have information that's out there, data that's out there that's not being reported. Okay, so these are things that the layman can look at as he evaluates what we call the deliverances of science. And that just has to do with the data. Then when we get to the second question, the question of how is the data interpreted? And what happens when you get to the interpretation of the data, all kinds of other things come in. The worldview, for example, of the scientist becomes a factor. His philosophy. Does he believe that all there is the material, natural, physical universe? Or does he believe that there is some kind of non-material thing beyond the universe, a God or whatever? And his view of those things will affect how he interprets the data. Okay, and also just how he reasons. How does he employ logic? Is he committing logical fallacies? And so when we think back to our classes on epistemology and argumentation and all that sort of thing that we talked about a number of weeks ago, those are things which lie in the domain of everybody. Okay, we all have access to the issues of logic and reasoning and philosophical assumptions and that sort of thing. And so when we see scientists employing those things, which they have to do, everybody has to do as they interpret the data, then we as laymen are in a place to evaluate: are they reasoning well? Okay, are they employing good logic? What about their assumptions? Are their assumptions justified? What are the philosophical presuppositions that are at play? And this becomes particularly important when scientists do, and sometimes they'll do this unconsciously, but sometimes they'll do it intentionally. When a scientist uses his credibility as a scientist to try and win people's opinion in areas that lie outside of science. Okay. Now, we're familiar with this phenomena because we run into it all the time. For example, in politics, as oftentimes politicians or people promoting a particular social agenda will sometimes quote or cite some movie star or some celebrity. Okay. Well, a movie star has no more authority or credibility when it comes to politics or social issues than you or I. So why should I regard their opinion as any more important than your opinion or my opinion, right? Well, the same thing happens with science. When a scientist speaks about science, he carries some degree of credibility, all right? But when he uses his credibility as a scientist to present philosophical arguments, for example, does God exist? Okay, he's out of his realm. Okay, he's completely out of his realm. Well, I say he's out of his realm. He may not be. He may be a theologian. He may have studied the issue very carefully. He may have also studied philosophy. But what I'm saying is, we don't accept his opinion on areas outside of science just because he's a scientist. That doesn't make him qualified. Okay, I came across a couple quotes here from this guy, Richard Weaver. He wrote about 50 years ago. He was a professor of English and a historian, I believe from University of Chicago, as I recall. But I really like this quote because it really elaborates on what we've been talking about. He says, "Indeed, the layman must not presume to question the facts assembled by a qualified scientist, although what constitutes the fact itself is sometimes debatable." So that's the issue we were just talking about facts or the data. "Nevertheless, we need to look at the matter from greater perspective and remember that no science exists purely in the form of a collection of facts. The sciences are these facts plus the structures of reasoning that are built upon them. The facts we are bound to receive the facts we are bound to receive if they come from sources that have given satisfactory evidence of their objectivity, but the reasoning that is done on the basis of them is open to the inquiry of every man who has a rational faculty." And then he goes on a little bit later and he says, this is merely saying that the layman has the right to ask about the connection between the factual evidence and the conclusion when that connection is not apparent to him. He has the right to ask philosophical questions about the way the facts have been handled and even about whether all of the relevant facts have been taken into consideration." So Weaver is just making this point that I've been trying to make, that it certainly is within the prerogative of the layman, and I think to some degree within the responsibility of the layman to not just listen to what science tells us, but to think carefully about it and to evaluate it and to assess it. Now, as I've already alluded to, this whole question of what is science and defining science is actually a little bit more difficult than we might think. I talk about science, you talk about science, you mention science, and it's very common that we just kind of, well, I know what he's talking about. I know what I'm talking about when I talk about science. But it turns out that defining science is a little bit of a challenge, okay? And one of the reasons for that is there are different kinds of science. So, for example, there's what we might call the hard sciences, which would be chemistry and physics, okay? Particularly physics. And then there's what we might think of as what are sometimes referred to as the soft sciences, things like maybe sociology or psychology or things like that, all right? So there are different kinds of science, and particularly one division that I think is helpful to understand is what's called observational science. So observational science is, as it sounds like, it's doing science where we can actually observe things, right? We can actually observe what's happening. So, for example, it'd be like the things you can do in a laboratory. So you can go in a laboratory and you can see how two objects relate to one another or affect one another, or you can put various chemicals together and see what you get. And you can actually observe those things, and you can repeat them over and over again to see if you get the same results, okay? So this is what we might call observational science. But then there's also what we could call historical science. And what historical science does is it seeks to understand how did things come to be the way we see them now, okay? So one very common area we're all familiar with where historical science works is in criminal forensics, right? So a detective comes on a crime scene, he looks at it, he sees the way things are, the body's here and there's evidence, he looks at the way the situation is and he asks the question, how did it come to be that way? Okay? So that's historical. He can't actually observe it. He didn't observe the crime. He didn't observe the murder, so to speak, all right? And he can't even repeat it, okay? He can kind of restage it a little bit, but he can't actually repeat the murder, right? So it's not repeatable and it's not observable, but by applying the scientific method, he seeks to understand how did things come to be the way they are. But of course, this goes even much further back. All right, so it's not just, who committed the crime yesterday, but it's also the question of how did we get all these different kind of animals in the world, or all these different kind of plants? How did all these species arise? Okay, that's historical science. Or the question of how did the Earth come to be, or how did the cosmos come to be? How did those things happen? Those are things that happened in the past. We have the cosmos now. We have the Earth now, and we're trying to use the scientific method to try to figure out, well, how did we get from wherever we were to here, okay? So that's what we might call historical science. Well, what this means then, if you've got all these different kinds of sciences, okay, if you're going to work up a definition of science, you've got to have one that's broad enough to include all the things we think of as science, right? But also it has to be specific enough to be useful. If it's just too general, then everything is science. A woman sitting in her tent doing a seance, or forecasting your future or whatever in a crystal ball, that would be science. If we don't somehow narrow our definition down, and that turns out to be a whole lot more difficult than people think. So as it turns out, there is no generally accepted definition of science. Okay, so when you talk to philosophers of science, you listen to philosophers of science, they will give you different definitions. And there's a lot of similarity, of course, there's a lot of overlap, but there tend to be differences because it actually is fairly challenging. So, example, we have this brilliant guy, Michael Ruse. He happens to be an atheist, or an agnostic at least, who's a brilliant philosopher of science, okay? And he's given this definition of science. In one place, he may give other definitions in other places, but one definition I came across, and I think this definition is inadequate. See if you can see why I think this definition is inadequate. But he gives this definition: science deals only with the natural, the repeatable, that which is governed by law. Okay? So when you look at that definition, do you see anything in there that you might go, well, given what we've said about science so far, is there anything in there that you might go, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure if that works or not? Repeatable. Okay, right, okay. So certainly science deals with the natural, we would all agree with that, right? And because it's dealing with the natural, it's dealing with natural law, what's governed by law. But we've just seen that in historical science, things aren't always repeatable, right? So as good as that definition is, it's still a little inadequate. So this whole idea of how we define science, how we think of science, becomes important because that's how we establish what are the limits of science. What can science do and what can't science do, okay? So I'm going to really stick my neck out here, okay? Having said that it's really hard to define science and that philosophers of science who are a lot smarter than I struggle with the definition, I'm going to give you my working definition of science, okay? So my definition that we'll work with here is science is the systematic study of the physical and natural world, employing an array of accepted tools such as reason, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, measurement, data, evidence, prediction, induction, inference to the best explanation, which is abduction, we've talked about that before, in order to understand the laws and explanations of the natural world. Now that's a pretty broad definition, right? And may be so broad it may not be useful in some cases. So take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but that's kind of my working definition. So the question then is science just kind of hanging out there? Is it just there? Or is it based on something? Okay? And when we think about the history of science, it's really instructive to understand where modern science as we think of it today came from. Because modern science actually grows out of the field of what is called natural philosophy. So the very early modern scientists, so we go back to the 16th and 17th century, and even before that, the early modern scientists were all philosophers. Okay? So they operated in the field of philosophy, and and what we think of as the study of the natural world was simply a category within the broader field of philosophy. So now we think of them as two very distinct fields. There's philosophy over here and there's science over here. But originally, science originated as a subcategory within philosophy. So these great minds, these great philosophers of the late medieval era and then into the Renaissance period and the 16th and 17th century, these were guys who were oftentimes very advanced theologians. They were philosophers, and in practicing their philosophy and their theology, they looked at the natural world and tried to understand the natural world. Okay? So what that means is that modern science grows out of philosophy. Okay? And that's an important thing for us to understand, because what many scientists want to do today is they want to draw a hard line between philosophy and science, and you can't do that. Okay? So, for example, I believe it was Stephen Hawking in one of his books said, philosophy is dead. Okay? But when he said that, he's making a philosophical statement, right? And he goes through his whole book there, making all kinds of assertions about what science tells us and that sort of thing, and he's just spouting philosophy all over the place, meanwhile claiming philosophy is dead. So you've got a handout there, and on one side of your handout there, I've got science's philosophical assumptions, okay? And the thing that we need to understand is that before a scientist ever walks into his laboratory, before a kid who's decided he wants to go into science, before he ever matriculates at college, before he ever enters his first science classroom, if he's going to do science, he has to assume all of these things. Okay? These are the philosophical presuppositions. Okay? So, for example, the existence of a theory-independent external world. So he has to assume that there is an external world to him, that there actually is a reality out there, okay, and that it is theory-independent. He has to assume the existence of truth. He has to assume the reliability of his cognitive faculties. Okay, and on down through the list. I won't list them all, I won't mention them all there, but you've got the list in your handout, okay? So he has to assume all those things. These are a prioris. These things come first. These are his presuppositions or her presuppositions before they ever do science. And all of science rests on those. And the significant thing about that is none of these can be proven by the scientific method. None of those assumptions on your list there can be proven in the laboratory. Okay? They have to be assumed a priori, philosophically. So you have to get to them either through philosophical argument, or you just have to accept them at face value, kind of as a brute fact. All right? But there is no way to establish them scientifically, and not only that, but as in everything that gets said and done in philosophy, there's always somebody who disagrees, right? So actually, on all of those points, there's at least some philosopher somewhere or some school of philosophy that challenges each one of those 10 things. Okay, so it's not like we can just take them at face value. We need to really think: are these things true? Now, I happen to think they all are true. All right, because most of them I have thought through to some level, or at least, they just seem on the face, just prima facie true, and so I just accept them at face value. But, so I do believe they're true, but what we need to recognize is when the scientist goes into his laboratory and he employs these presuppositions as he begins to do science, he's assuming things, he's working off presuppositions that have not been proven scientifically and that have been challenged by philosophical thinkers, at least at some point in history. Okay, so they are accepted a priori. They're accepted without any scientific evidence. They're accepted without any scientific justification. Now, science works because these things work. Okay, because these things are true, science works, but science doesn't prove them. All right, science grows out of them. So this is very important for us to understand. So if you think of it as in a diagram form, like I have up here, science is the edifice. Science is the structure. It's the building or the house, and that house is built on this foundation of philosophical knowledge or philosophical presuppositions or a prioris. Okay, so what that means then is there are limits to what science can do. So science can speak authoritatively within the scope of its definition. That's why I mentioned why definition is important. However people define science, pretty much everybody's in agreement that science is the study of the material, the natural, the physical world. That's what science studies, and that's what science knows. Okay. So when science speaks about the physical world, the natural world, it can speak with authority. All right. But science cannot speak about anything that lies outside of that realm of scientific knowledge, okay, that realm that science can explore. So science cannot tell us, no matter how much Richard Dawkins protests to the opposite, science can't tell us whether or not anything exists beyond the physical world. Science can't tell us that. All right? And because science can't tell us whether or not anything exists beyond the natural world, science certainly can't tell us if there were something out there, what that something is like. So even when the scientist operating as a scientist does believe there is something beyond the non-material, beyond the material world, even if he does believe that, he cannot, by using science, tell us what that's like. Okay? If he's going to tell us what that's like, he's got to use some other source of knowledge. And here's the interesting thing. Science can't even define itself. All right? So I mentioned when we were talking about definition of science, I talked about philosophers of science, right? So it's the philosophers of science who attempt to define science and what science is. It's not the scientists themselves. It's the philosophers of science, all right? So science has this realm of knowledge, and it can only speak within that realm. So what we run into, though, is a problem of something that's called scientism, okay? And that suffix at the end, ism, gives you a clue as to what we're talking about. So we're talking about some kind of philosophical or religious belief about science, all right? And what scientism is it's the belief that science is the sole source of knowledge and reality. So the idea is, really, science is the only source of knowledge. And I can't really know anything unless I can know it scientifically. All right? So there's no reality that doesn't lie within this realm of scientific knowledge. All right? So that's the idea of scientism. And there are kind of two types of scientism. There's a very strong version of scientism. And in the strong version of scientism, the argument is, just as I've just said, there are no truths or knowledge apart from the deliverances of science. So the only way we can know something is through science. It's the only source of knowledge. Okay? Weak scientism will acknowledge that there are other sources of knowledge, but science is the authoritative one. Science is kind of the king of the hill, so to speak. All right? So you have these other sources of knowledge, but they are subject to the deliverances of science. All right? So that would be weak scientism. And this is very strong within our culture. It's very strong. I even have to fight against that. I have to fight against the inclination to think, okay, the only way I can really know something, is if science shows it's true to me. That's the only way I can really know something, okay? So David Berlinski is a great mind, philosopher and mathematician, and as he describes the role of scientism in our culture, he says, he describes it as science as the single system of belief in which rational men and women might place their faith, okay? And he says, like any militant church, this one places a familiar demand before all others, thou shalt have no other God before me. Okay? And this really is the attitude of scientism, particularly strong scientism, is we reign. Science reigns supreme, and everything else is subjected to the authority of science. But scientism is really fatally flawed. And one of the reasons it's flawed is because scientism takes statements about science and confuses them with statements of science. So when scientism says science is the sole source of knowledge, that's a statement about science, right? But that is not a statement that science can establish. You can't prove that in a laboratory. You can't prove it using historical science or any other sciences. You can't prove it through physics or chemistry. There's no way to prove that scientifically. So the claim that science is the sole source of knowledge is a claim about science. It is not a claim that we get scientifically, right? It's a claim we get philosophically. So the statement that science exhausts the entire scope of reality is a statement about science, but is not itself, nor can it ever be a statement proved by science. So we have then really the Achilles heel of scientism, and particularly with strong scientism, it's self-refuting. Okay, so we've talked about in our lessons on argumentation and logic and that sort of thing, we talked about self-refuting arguments, okay? And scientism, strong scientism particularly, is a self-refuting argument, okay? Because what scientism is saying is it's saying you cannot know anything outside of the natural world, and we know that there's nothing outside of the natural world. In other words, it's claiming to know something that it also claims it cannot know. So it's a self-refuting argument, okay? So when you think about it in the form of a diagram, think of this circle here, this blue circle here. And what we have here is this would represent the material, the natural, the physical world, okay? So this is what science can know about. By our definition of science, and probably just about everybody's definition of science, this is what science can know. Okay? It can know about the material natural world. And that's the limit. Okay? Now, of course, what scientism says is that's all there is, right? But all of us know, if you stop and think about it, that there are things outside of that, right? So within the natural world, we have things like chemistry and geology and human physiology, and we have all those sorts of things. But there's outside of that world, we all know that there are other things, right? So what might some of them be? Well, if there is a God, God would be one of them. The laws of logic lie outside the field of science. That's in the field of philosophy. That's not in the field of science. Epistemology, how do we know things? Okay, that can't be scientifically established. Moral values, what is beauty? Okay, scientists can tell us, how we see and how we detect beauty, but science can't tell us what beauty is. Why one thing is beautiful and another thing, why a mountain landscape is beautiful and a city dump isn't. It can't tell us that, right? Those are all things which lie outside. They may relate to the natural world, but the truth about those things lies outside of the field of science, right? So that would be the flaw with strong scientism. But when we think about weak scientism, okay, it's not making quite as bold a claim. So it's not saying science is the only knowledge. It's just saying science is the most authoritative knowledge, okay? So we have these other sources of knowledge, but you really got to kind of run them through science, so to speak, to make sure they're really true, okay? But here's the problem with that. If science is, as we pointed out, founded on certain philosophical presuppositions, then you have the weakest link problem, right? So if science is based on philosophical presuppositions, then what's more authoritative? The philosophy is more authoritative than the science, right? Or the theology is more important and more authoritative than the than the science itself, right? So it's a problem of the weakest link. So in scientism, what you get is you get this body of knowledge, okay, that's beyond, or in weak scientism, you get this body of knowledge that's beyond science. So they'll acknowledge philosophy, and they'll acknowledge religious truth, and they'll acknowledge things like that, okay? But science is the foundation to them, okay? And so everything rests upon this. Well, as it turns out, it's really the other way around, okay? So science is the edifice which is built upon these a priori philosophical assumptions. Now, let's move on then to talk about this supposed war between Christianity and science. So the idea is science and Christianity have always been at war. Christianity has always opposed science. Christianity has been about dogma, and science has been about truth and reality and that sort of thing, right? And this idea of this ongoing long-term battle between science and faith, science and Christianity, really goes back to the Enlightenment. So during the Enlightenment period in the 17th and 18th centuries, you get this development of this myth about this war between Christianity and science. And the idea is that throughout its history, Christianity has tried to suppress scientific advancement, scientific knowledge, and that sort of thing, okay? And according to this myth, this goes all the way back to the fall of Rome. So you have the rise of Christianity that coincides, of course, with the fall of Rome. Some people in the Enlightenment tried to even blame the fall of Rome on the rise of Christianity. But the idea is that once Rome fell, and Rome was supposedly, according to this myth, this very enlightened, progressive culture and society, that when Rome fell and Christianity became the dominant philosophy in Western civilization, that plunged Western civilization into the Dark Ages, into 1,000 years of the Dark Ages. Well, as it turns out, the truth is really quite different than the myth, okay? So the fact is that with only a few notable exceptions, and non-Christians and skeptics are quick to point out those exceptions, but with only a few exceptions, Christianity has actually encouraged scientific knowledge, scientific development, scientific research, and that sort of thing. So when modern science really got rolling in the late medieval era and then up into the early modern era, when it really got rolling, it got rolling out of the universities. That's, of course, even today, much of our scientific progress is focused in the universities. But the fact is that all of the early universities were founded by the church, okay? And they were funded by the church, right? So you have the Christian worldview, and whatever you think of Catholicism, it's certainly held to a essentially Christian worldview. So what you have is the Christian worldview is founding these universities, funding these universities, in which all of this scientific knowledge and discovery was going on. And in fact, and there have been many historians who have pointed this out. Rodney Stark is a sociologist and historian down at Baylor, and he's done tremendous work on this. But historians across the spectrum now recognize that science was born and grew and developed in the West, in Western civilization, in the Christian West, and only in the Christian West. So of course we have scientific discovery and that sort of thing, scientific studies going on in other parts of the world now. But where it began was in the Christian West, and it began in the Christian West because of the Christian worldview. Okay? And scientists, philosophers of science, historians of science across the board now recognize and acknowledge that. In contrast to the myth that was propagated beginning in the Enlightenment, but many people still believe it today. There never was a Dark Ages. We'll talk more about this when we get into our history module, but there never was a period of time in which intellectual, philosophical, scientific, and technological exploration and discoveries and that sort of thing were dormant. There just was not a time like that. So all the way through the medieval era that's referred to as the Dark Ages, and particularly if you get into the latter half of the medieval era, you get all kinds of exciting developments and progress that's being made. Okay, so this whole idea of the Dark Ages and the church plunged the world into these Dark Ages is a myth. In addition to that, these long line of scientists, of thinkers, philosophers, and scientists who laid the groundwork for modern science were all religious believers. They were priests, they were monks, they were cardinals, people like that. So they were people who held to a very strong Christian worldview, and it was out of that worldview that their science grew and developed. So, for example, Rodney Stark, I just mentioned him. Rodney Stark did a study of the 52 great scientists of the 16th and 17th century. And he studied their writings and things to try to determine what was the level of their religious belief. And of the 52 great scientists that he studied, he found that 60% of them were very devout. It was very obvious from their writings that they were very devout in their religious faith, okay, in their Christian faith. 20 of them, 38%, they were obviously Christian in their outlook. Their degree of devoutness he couldn't detect from their writings, and so he just listed them as conventional. And so 98% of the 52, in other words, all but one of them, were individuals who had a very strong Christian worldview. And it was out of that worldview that their science grew. And this is what we should expect if we really understand what the Bible has to say about faith. And of course, if we go back to our classes on epistemology and knowledge, we remember that this whole idea that there's some kind of a conflict between faith and reason is a false dichotomy. Okay, so we won't cover that ground again, but we saw that there is no dichotomy, there is no tension between faith and reason. And furthermore, it should be a clue to us that all the early scientists were at least professing Christians in their faith, okay? And many scientists even today are Christians. So I just, several of us spent, 6 hours yesterday in the choir room over there watching this streaming of this conference on science and faith. And these are all Christian, very profound Christian thinkers who are scientists. So when you think about all the Christians who are in the field of science even today, as well as all those in the past, it's very clear that they don't see any kind of intrinsic conflict between their faith and their scientific work. Okay? So that should be a clue to us. And when we get into the Bible, we see why. So right off the bat, of course, in the Bible, man is created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, right? And so what we see in the Bible is that God is a reasoning, knowing, personal being, okay? He created us in His image, so He created us also as knowing, reasoning beings. I was just thinking about this idea this morning as I was getting ready for the lesson this morning, and I was just thinking about that verse, I believe it is in Isaiah, where He says, "Come, let us reason together." It's the idea, God is a reasoner, okay? And He has created us in the Imago Dei. He has created us also to be knowers and to be reasoners. So this is foundational to the whole idea that we can do science, right? Furthermore, what we see in the creation account is this very profound emphasis on the creation of order out of chaos. So you see God taking a chaotic world, a chaotic universe, and making order out of it. So we've talked about the whole thing about male and female and light and dark and seas and dry lands and all this. So what we see is God making order out of this chaotic universe. And what's significant about that is you've got to have an orderly cosmos, you've got to have an orderly universe, or you can't do science, right? Science is based on the assumption that there are laws of nature, that there is an orderliness to the world, right? If we go on and we think more, you get the creation mandate. So the creation mandate there in Genesis 1 to Adam is he is commanded to rule and subdue the natural world. Well, if he's going to rule and subdue the natural world, what does that imply? That implies that he has to understand it, right? So the creation mandate actually would include science. It would include the study of the natural and the material world. He can't rule and subdue the natural world unless he understands it. And some examples of that at work we see right off the bat in the creation accounts, all right? So the Bible even talks about the first scientific endeavors, right? So in Genesis chapter 2, God commands Adam and Eve, he commands them to cultivate and till the garden. What is that? Okay, that's plant husbandry, right? He's commanding, okay, I want you to till the garden, I want you to cultivate the garden. What does that imply? That implies that they have to have a knowledge of how plants grow. What do I need to do to till the ground? What does tilling the ground do? How do I cultivate these plants? How do I help them grow? That implies acquiring knowledge about plant husbandry. Furthermore, we get the first example of taxonomy with Adam, right? So God brings the animals to Adam, and what does Adam do? You know, he names the animals. In other words, he is categorizing the animal kingdom. He's doing the very first example of taxonomy, okay? Certainly very basic, very primitive in one sense, but it is very clear that this is what God expects of Adam and Eve. And this is what God expects of us as humans. He expects us to engage in these scientific endeavors. So far from science being at odds with the Bible actually from the very beginning mandates that we as human beings engage in the scientific endeavor. So we talked about this before. For the sake of time, I'm just going to, I just want to mention it. As Plantinga points out, the real conflict is not between science and the Bible or science and the Christian faith, but as Plantinga and even atheist philosophers have pointed out, the real conflict lies with Darwinian evolution and naturalism. Okay, so in Darwinian naturalism, or Darwinian evolution and naturalism, the idea that the material world is all there is, then the human cognitive powers derive from random mutations and natural selection. And natural selection works to select out those attributes, those qualities which enhance survivability, right? That's the whole philosophy of Darwinism, okay? So in other words, our cognitive abilities, our abilities to think are a product of, according to naturalistic Darwinism, are a product of these naturalistic mutations selected for survivability, which means my cognitive abilities were not selected by natural selection to yield truth, but only to yield survivability. And the atheist evolutionists recognize that. Okay? And here's the way they recognize it. One is they know, the atheists know, that the overwhelming vast majority of people in the world are religious believers of one type or another. Okay, and so they need to account for how is it that 95% or whatever of human beings on the face of the planet have religious belief. And their explanation, of course, is that religious belief evolved. And their explanation is it evolved in some way, and they don't know how, but they say it evolved to help us survive. All right? So they recognize that our religious beliefs, they claim our religious beliefs help us survive, but they are not true. Right? The atheists would have claimed that our religious beliefs are not true. Right? So in other words, the atheist, the naturalist Darwinian is tacitly acknowledging that our cognitive abilities are there only for the sake of survivability and not for truth. Okay? And what that does then is that means there's no way to know if our cognitive abilities are producing true thoughts. So they would argue, well, they're producing religious belief in you, but those aren't true thoughts. And I say, well, if your theory is true, then you don't know whether your theory of evolution is true or not either. It's just there to help you survive, right? So it actually is, the real conflict lies there rather than between science and religion. So when we think about that, consistent naturalism just by itself precludes the possibility of doing science, because a consistent naturalism, as we just saw, kind of undermines itself. So in order to do science, which of course many naturalists do, and they're highly invested in science, naturalism's pursuit of science is really operating on a borrowed capital. It's borrowing from theism. It's borrowing from the belief that the world is orderly, that there are laws in the universe, and that truth is knowable, that we can know truth, and that human reasoning functions, generally speaking, functions successfully. Those are all ideas that don't grow out of naturalism, as we just saw from Plantinga's point. They don't grow out of naturalism, they come from a theistic worldview. So naturalism's pursuit of science is really borrowing from theism in order to do science. And so I would suggest, and I've actually just been suggesting this for the last few years, is if this is true, if our culture and our society's abandonment of religious faith and its conviction that all there is the material natural world, if our culture continues to move down that line, then it would make sense that eventually the scientific endeavor will be undermined. And our confidence as a culture and as a society in science will diminish. And you might say, well, that ain't happening. But I would suggest to you it already is happening. We're already seeing today, particularly even within the last couple of years, we're seeing people say things like, well, logic and reasoning, that's a Western construct. Okay, that's part of Western capitalism, and we need to overthrow that. Okay, and included in that Western that Western worldview is the idea of science, and so there are actually voices now coming to the fore within our culture that's saying, you know, well, we just can't trust science because science is this Western white man construct that he uses to dominate the rest of the world. All right, so it really is interesting. I started saying this several years ago before these present phenomena started to develop in our culture, but in some ways it looks like we're headed in that direction. That science is actually being undermined as we abandon the Christian faith. So I'm just gonna move on now because we're out of time. So next week then we're going to start dealing with specific scientific questions. So we're going to do several on origin. So we're going to do a week on the origin of the cosmos or the universe. Then we're going to do one on the origin of life. Then we're going to do one on Darwinism, specifically the origin of species. Those are two different things. The origin of life and the origin of the species are two entirely different questions. Okay, and so we'll deal with them as separate questions. Then we're going to deal with the really important question theologically is the origins of humans. You know, did we evolve or are we a special creation? And then we'll deal with the whole question of miracles. Are miracles possible? So those are coming weeks that we've got a lot of work cut out for us. So, okay. Any questions, comments?